when you make creative work. My name's Nick Bailey. I am the CEO and creative partner at a business called Future Factor. Before I was at Future Factor, I spent 20 years working in creative agencies, leading creative teams on brands like Nike and Heineken. And I wanted to share today a bit of insight from those 2 decades of working in the creative space and talk about some of the factors that are in play these days as we work inside creative businesses. So first up, a bit of bumper sticker wisdom. So who doesn't like a bit of bumper sticker wisdom? Why do we think we're looking at a Ford car? Well, you probably all know this statement, right? It's a bit of a cliche, but cliches are true for a reason. So Henry Ford said when he created the Model T Ford, if I'd asked people what they want, they'd have said faster horses. And this plays really into something that I experienced, I guess, throughout those 2 decades working in the creative industry, but particularly more recently, where clients come to the creative briefing process really already with a very preconceived idea of what they want the answer to be. And creative teams are constrained and constricted by an expectation that they're going to deliver something specific. And of course, the magic of creativity is that it's about creating something new and it's about creating something unexpected. What I always think about when I think about creativity is how strange it is that it's so siloed within organizations. So, you know, there's probably a bunch of people in this room who play sport, who run, who are active. Maybe you went running this morning in the rain. Also, I imagine when you were kids, you took up a paintbrush or a pencil. Very naturally, it's something that came to you spontaneously. You didn't have to think about it. You didn't need to be taught how to be creative. And yet, in the world of creative businesses, and I guess a lot of you people work in creative businesses, we all of us hear about creativity, about innovation all the time. We treat creativity as if it was a professional skill that can be learned. Now, I lived through the evolution of digital creativity, and something that began to evolve in the early 2000s and into the 2010s was a formalization of the process of bringing together technology and creative, and a bringing together of the two ways of thinking about innovation and creative development. And one observation, I guess, from that process is that the skills and the experience and the expertise required to develop technology and the skills and the expertise required to think creatively are two very different things, obviously. When it comes to code, of course, that's something that you absolutely need to learn. When it comes to creativity, that's something magical. Now, if you're on the creative side of that process, you're going to feel really passionately about the value of creativity. When you're on the client side of that process, it's very easy to eliminate that from your balance sheet because it's something that's kind of hard to quantify. But there are some incredibly powerful examples of the commercial impact that real creative thinking can have. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about what I mean by real creative thinking and real creativity in a commercial context. So this, of course, is Lego. You must all know the story. In the late 90s, Lego was struggling as a business, and you can see why. They're a toy business. They make physical stuff that kids take home and play with. And at that time, screens and digital tech were really exploding, and the received wisdom was, okay, well, you know, maybe the days of toys are kind of over, and we as a business, Lego, we're going to be managing our decline, and we're going to be thinking about, you know, what the future looks like maybe without us. And this kind of tells its own story. At this point in sort of early 2000s, Lego changed their CEO, and they changed their whole approach to innovation and the relationship between what they do as a business, and how that then expresses itself through the work. And of course, you guys all know about the Lego movie and about the partnerships that that turned Lego into effectively an entertainment and a content business. Now, you don't transform a company from being a failing business that is about to sort of drop through the floor to being one of the most successful entertainment and content businesses in the world without accepting the power of creativity. Apple, of course, is a very obvious example, but I put this up here because it's worth just kind of pulling apart that headline, which was the review in The Guardian for the iPhone 11, and thinking about, you know, how it comes to pass that people are prepared to pay 30 or 40% more for the same product. Because when you really pull it apart, particularly now coming out of China, so brands like Xiaomi and Huawei, they actually make, from a functional perspective, better products than Apple do. But people are still prepared to pay 30% more for that product, and they do that because of the emotional relationship that they have with the brand, and they do that because of the creative commitment that that brand has made, and the vision, actually, in the case of Apple, of one individual who's prepared to invest everything behind creativity. So that then sort of translates into the world of marketing through the relationship between agencies and brands. So this was the stage at the Cannes Lions Festival of Creativity in the summer just gone. So this year, this was Burger King winning Creative Marketer of the Year. And I love this quote from the CMO of Burger King, which is, you know, you can't just throw dollars at agencies and expect good creative to come out. So when businesses build really effective relationships between the visionary marketeers at the heart of that business and the creative partners that they work with, not just creative magic can happen, but commercial magic can happen too. But how do you operationalize that, and how do you make that possible within a business environment and within a commercial environment? Well, you know, the answer, of course, is that it's not easy, but I want to talk about a few principles that kind of I've learned to live with as a creative leader, and that I think that you can instill in a business culturally if you think about it in the right way. So I've got a couple of examples from the dim and distant past, just because I'm old, but they to me are particularly instructive about the power and the potential of creativity. And the first is Nike. So I was lucky enough to work on this brand for a number of years. Does anyone recognize what this picture is? Sir? The first Nike shoe, yeah, what was called the waffle racer. That is the waffle iron that Bill Bowerman used to make the waffle racer. Bill Bowerman was a running coach at Oregon University, and his relationship with Phil Knight was what gave birth to the Nike business. Before this shoe, everyone ran in racing spikes, so shoes with spikes on the bottom. And if you had asked runners what they needed, they certainly wouldn't have said, well, we need a shoe with a sole that's molded in a waffle iron. That moment of inspiration came from approaching a problem completely tangentially, not thinking about what the brief is, but thinking about what opportunity might arise from innovation. And that can come from any number of places, but you have to open yourself up to the possibility of difference, and that's where the power comes. And that's how this incredible, one of the most valuable companies in the world was created. When you work on Nike, you very quickly learn the purpose of the business. It's wrapped up in a single statement, which is we exist to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world. And that's the only measure of success, whether that's of a product or whether that's of the marketing that comes out of that business. It's an incredibly smart way to build a company around a very, very single-minded sense of purpose around creativity. But that is about being prepared to break things to fix things. So if you want to live dangerously as a business, you have to be prepared to eliminate the pre-existing wisdom, the way of doing things. You have to be prepared to smash down some idols, and in the case of running, it was running shoes. We're going to watch a bit of film of this. You must recognize this, no doubt. Of course, this is an Alexander McQueen show, and we'll just watch 2 minutes of this just because it's fabulous. Had anyone not seen that before? Good, you all cut, great. So we've introduced something fabulous. I wanted to share that because what McQueen did very successfully was bring together creative disciplines in a way that was incredibly courageous and brave. And actually, you know, as with most creative ideas, the robot paint wasn't entirely new. He was inspired by an artist called Rebecca Horns who makes physical objects, and she created robots with machine guns on them. And he kind of inspired by that, he brought that into his show. The flip side of what McQueen does, of course, sadly, was focus incredibly rigorously around craft. So he spent 20 years working in the back rooms of tailors, understanding and learning how to make brilliant clothes before then going out and smashing and breaking all of those rules and bringing together inspiration from the worlds of art, from the world of music, and creating some of the most iconic, extraordinary, groundbreaking shows, but also iconic, extraordinary, groundbreaking clothes. And he did that by being prepared to live dangerously and break rules. He said, give me enough time and I'll create a revolution. He also said, and this is, I guess, the right place to be sharing this quote, I can create a collection in a day, and I often do because I've always got a bunch of Italians on my back telling me to hurry up. So that was his experience of living and working in this incredible country, in this incredible city. Levi's were in the 90s a brand facing real challenge. There was some scandal around the way that their product was being produced. They were looking to reinvent their business through their marketing. And I wanted to share this example with you, and it's from the 90s, so it's from a long, long time ago, but it's, I think, one of the archetypal examples of how really brilliant creative work from an unexpected source absolutely transformed a brand. And those of us who work with brands and in the world of marketing, we're seeking out those opportunities to say, well, through the idea that we had, through the creative work that we made, we transformed this brand. And this is from the UK, and this is one of a series of ads that ran in maybe the early 90s. So I'll play it and then we'll chat briefly about it.
I'm mad about the boy, and I know it's stupid to be mad about a boy. I'm so ashamed of it, but must admit the sleepless nights I've had about the boy. On the silver screen, he melts my foolish heart in every single scene. Although I'm quite aware that here and there are traces of the cad about
So this is a really beautiful piece of advertising, incredibly well art directed, and at the time it was a huge leap forward for that brand and a very courageous step into a world of style, but in terms of the way that everything looked and felt, but particularly around music. So the music choice was kind of left field for the brand at the time. This ad was the follow-up to a very famous piece of advertising set in a laundrette to Marvin Gaye heard it on the grapevine. And it so happened that the marketing director at Levi's at the time was an incredibly committed Motown music fan. So it was his vision, coupled with the agency that he hired, that created this completely transformative piece of communication for a brand that was really struggling in this market. And they did that by firing their existing agency and hiring an agency which at the time had only 11 employees. So it was a hugely risky thing for a global established brand like Levi's to be doing, to be hiring a team of 11 people who had absolutely no track record. Now that team of 11 people was BBH, Bogle Bartle Hegarty, so it became one of the most famous and most awarded advertising agencies in the world, and this was the work that established their reputation. But this work would never have happened if it wasn't for a client who was prepared, A, to take a risk with the agency that he appointed, and then B, to take a risk by shifting the brand into, this all seems quite vanilla to us now, but it's quite kind of, it's pretty sexy, it's a bit homoerotic. In the mid-90s, you didn't see stuff like that on TV, so it was kind of shocking to see, but it was a brave piece of work and it was transformative. This is a more recent example, and I don't have a film to show around it. I just want to talk about it because it's not so much a piece of creative work, but it's a piece of creative thinking that has transformed this brand. You may know this example because it was awarded and talked about a lot in the last couple of years. Outerwear brand, so a brand a bit like Patagonia, who chose to close their store on Black Friday. So I guess Black Friday is less of a thing in Europe than it is in the US, but in the US it is massive. Everybody goes shopping on Black Friday. Of course, it's the day between Thanksgiving and then the holiday weekend. So to kind of close your store on the biggest shopping day of the year is kind of nuts. It garnered the brand a huge amount of attention, and it was effective in terms of piece of creative communication because it absolutely cut to the heart of what that brand is about, which is going out and exploring the world. So that brand, they sell outerwear. Yes, they're a retailer, but they were courageous enough to say, on this day when everyone's going shopping, we don't want you to go shopping. We want you to go out and explore America and discover the beauty of this country and, yeah, maybe wear our outerwear. And commercially, that's had a disproportionate effect on the success of that business. So they're doing incredibly well on the back of that. Next, I'll declare an interest here. I wanted to share something personal because this is a bit of work that I did with Heineken years and years ago. But it came out of that, I guess, that same appetite to challenge and to give the client something that they kind of hadn't asked for. So it's a bit of fun. It's a couple of minutes long, and then I'll talk about how that evolved. So way back when the UEFA Champions League final was going to be in Brazil, client came to us and said, look, we want to create a promotional process to get people to sign up for a competition to win tickets. And a young creative team at the agency I was with at the time just had this idea for, it's Brazil, it's Carnival, wouldn't it be fun to dress up a football team in Carnival gear and get them to play a match of football? Same budget as we had for what was effectively a pretty boring website sign up. And we just had a lot of passion for the idea, and we just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. We did it all in a day. We got a costume designer who does stuff for the Notting Hill Carnival. They're all a bit homemade and it's a bit of fun. It was absolutely freezing. We got a real small-sided team just to play a real game of football, and we did it super cheaply. But we did it because we really believed that the answer to this brief was not a boring sign-up site. The answer to this brief was about getting people fired up and excited about the idea of Brazil, and we were going to do that through a piece of storytelling, not through a website. And that is something that is hard to do in agencies, and it's actually increasingly harder to do when you've got kind of procurement on your shoulder telling you that, you know, yes, you may want to do X, but the answer's got to be Y. And what is kind of nuts about that is, I think if you're one of the finance guys, is that when you've got creative people within an organization, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not like you have a bank of ideas at the beginning of the year, you know, like you have a bank of coding hours that you've got to, once you've used them up, right? You've got an inexhaustible mine of ideas. You dig up a diamond of an idea, you decide not to set it in your jewelry, that's fine. You can dig up another one, you can dig up another one. I love that idea that came from McQueen when he said, I can design a collection in a day. Brilliant ideas keep coming, and they keep coming if you are able to nurture that resource within your organization and create the conditions where your creative people feel empowered to deliver it. And when you start to think about creativity that way, I believe it seems even stranger that we do this. So you have an agency, you have an organization, you have a company, it doesn't matter what kind of business you are, but you say, you know, if we think about that kid at the beginning painting the picture, okay, well, 80%, 90%, 95% of our people don't get to think creatively. They don't get to contribute ideas because that's not their job title. We're just going to give it to these two people with kind of beards and tattoos, and everybody else, forget about it. It's not your job. It's an incredibly short-sighted and, if you think about it, really wasteful way of using what is essentially this magic sort of fountain of creativity and resource that you have at your disposal when you run a company. So it's easy to kind of say that, but how do you make that into something that you can actually build on, operationalize, and turn into a business process? So I'm going to talk about kind of 3 principles that I think are hopefully kind of actionable for you in whatever organization it is that you work in. And the first is about listening. And if you work in a creative business, probably you're going to be familiar with the idea of brainstorming. That's how we make ideas happen, right? We get everyone together in a room, and we follow these rules, which, to be honest, in the many, many brainstorms I've been part of, very few people actually adhere to. And then out of this process emerges ideas. Now, one of the things that I think is dangerous about this process is that it inhibits most people's ability to contribute. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is a picture of a house called Transition House. And it's in the US, and it is a halfway house for battered women, for women who've experienced domestic abuse. And houses like this began to come into existence in the late 60s and the early 70s. Now, why am I showing you this in the context of talking about creativity and developing ideas and brainstorming? Well, I'm showing you this because out of these kinds of communities emerged radical new ideas about how hierarchies can work, about how organizations can and should be structured. And this happened at a very accelerated pace because it was a reaction to injustice. It was a reaction to a world that didn't work for women. And there was a fascinating article about this house in particular in the New York Times, which I recommend you look up. And these communities learned very quickly about what worked and what didn't work. And what I think is fascinating about the insights that emerged from the decision-making processes in these sorts of communities was because it's exactly what happens in agencies. It's exactly what happens in creative departments and in brainstorms. Because creative departments are these sort of protected zones that the rest of the business feels they can't kind of interfere with, which in some respects is great. But in other respects, what that often means is that the people with the loudest voice are the people who are heard, and the people who feel uncomfortable and inhibited in those kinds of environments, they don't get to contribute. And that's what happened in Transition House and in these communities where hierarchies initially were completely eliminated. What happens when you eliminate hierarchies is you sort of come down to the human level, and the individuals who are most able to exercise their own power get to exercise their power. And in creative departments, often that's the creative director, or it's some guy who looks like me with a beard who can shout the loudest. And people who feel they can't contribute don't get to contribute. So, my belief about creativity in business and creative departments in business is that if we really want to make this work and we really want to make commercial difference to organizations through having brilliant ideas, we've got to be prepared to break down those ways of doing things. We've got to be prepared to do it differently. The Quakers religious group have a really smart way of doing this, and this is something that we've begun to institute in our own brainstorming processes. And when Quakers have meetings, they appoint a single individual who's called the clerk of the meeting, and it's that person's job to listen and to write everything down and then to play that back to the session. Now, I don't know if any of you work in creative businesses, but if you try next time you're seeking to solve a creative problem just to do this, it's really, really amazing what emerges. You appoint one individual just to listen, just to capture, and we all carry recording devices now, so you can do that. And then it's their job to play that back at the end of the session. And what happens when you do that is all these magical ideas that you kind of hadn't heard emerge. So if we think of our job as creative people to be mining and nurturing those brilliant ideas that might be the waffle racer, it might be the robot on the fashion runway, it might be the idea that Lego becomes a content business. All of those ideas are at risk when they're in that process of development, when everyone's kind of trying to kind of mine them out and find them. So attuning your organization to really, really listening for ideas, and then creating an actual actionable process that allows you to hear those ideas is an incredibly powerful way of making that work and making that happen. The second principle is about freedom to play. Now, this is a jazz band, obviously. What's amazing about when you get a bunch of musicians together is they just go, and it's magic. And no one needs to talk to each other. They will just start to play, and particularly a bunch of jazz musicians. It's kind of magical. It's incredible. Now, if you can, do any of you work in advertising agencies or agencies? Any hands? None, some, him at the back, right? So what's kind of weird about ad agencies and so-called creative businesses is when you walk into those businesses, no one's doing any creative work most of the time. There's a lot of talking about work and not a lot of actual work. If you go into a fashion atelier, so we're in the fashion capital of Europe here, if you went into McQueen's studio, everyone would be cutting, sewing, drawing, working. Ad agencies, not so much. Other types of business that make stuff, commercial businesses, product businesses, not so much. We do a lot of talking about ideas, not so much making. Now, I'm a writer, and I know from my experience that, 20 minutes spent actually writing is worth 20 hours thinking about writing. You only unlock and unblock the process of creativity by doing it. And the way that we organize ourselves in, certainly in the world of ad businesses, kind of mitigates against that, because we sort of silo our creative moments into short meetings, and we have sort of chit-chats about how we're going to do it, and then we outsource it. So allowing ourselves the freedom to play can create unexpected and extraordinary connections. And I'm going to play one ad from the last year from one of my favorite brands, Nike, that sort of illustrates this. And this picture was the inspiration for the ad. And this picture led to a conversation that happened through the sorts of process that I'm talking about, where people were sitting together just working, riffing, jamming creatively. This is a picture from from a terrible event. It was from the UK, from a terrorist incident in the UK. But what's kind of people felt was particularly London about this picture was that the guy hasn't put his drink down. So there's a guy running from like almost certain death, but he's got a pint of beer in his hand. And that's a kind of a charming illustration of what it's like to be a Londoner. And that one picture gave rise to this film, which I might have to click again.
I've had the longest day, man. You said you were going to come to me, now you're telling me to come to you. I'm not getting on a cycle.
Cycle? That's light work. Man's got to run 2 miles from ends just to get to training. Serious, bro?
2 miles? Really? I have to run all the way from Zone 6 with my school bag. Oh, you think that's tough? I have to run through Peckham at night.
What's wrong with Peckham?
Oh yeah? Well, I gotta fight these waste man just to play. This is my multi-purpose. Council funded, football, tennis, basketball court. Bam!
Fighting? You don't know the meaning of fighting. I have to fight my whole family before I even walk in the ring.
That's nothing. In my family, if you're not in first place and you're considered a failure. I know, man. You're begging it. I got more chance of getting hit by lightning than going pro. It's mad. Man.
Are you serious? I've got to get to the biggest game of my life, score a banger, right in the top bins, just to be noticed.
She gets to play with other people. Lucky. No one plays ice hockey in London. I have to be my own team, my own opposition, and my own coach.
Yeah? Yeah? Well, I have to run to training, coach my own coach, carry my whole team, and I'm best mates. What with a roll V? No.
Huh?
Morning.
Oi, Mo! Ever play tennis in London?
That's easy. I only get one try to land it. Before getting caught by security. Yeah? Well, I gotta be my own security, cuz.
So, if this goes wrong, I'll break my leg!
What? Even when I win, I get a broken nose.
Well, if I stop swimming, I'll literally die!
I don't even have a whole bike.
I can't lie, I was raised in a struggle. And when it all goes off, I'll be there in the bubble right now. All I wanna do is bubble.
This is London.
So I love this because that's the kind of advertising equivalent of that jam, where you take that piece of inspiration, you work together, you play together, and you create these, dozen scenarios that bring to life that image, but through sport and through what it feels like to be part of that incredible city. And the last principle, which I think it's so important to apply to creativity, and again, it's really difficult to do in a commercial context, is just to persevere. And actually, it's easier and more instructive to look outside of the ad world to find real examples of this. And this is one of my favorite artists, an expressionist painter called Auerbach. And his process when he paints a portrait is to paint, scrape it off, paint again, scrape it off, paint it again, scrape it off, and he might do that up to 1,000 times for a portrait. And his description, or I guess the way he expresses what the process is he just says, well, I just know when the truth emerges. And that, I think, is so powerful and instructive around the way that I think all fields of creativity work, which is, you don't get to brilliance quickly or easily. You get to brilliance by persisting and persevering and being tenacious and being prepared to destroy what you've made and make it again and make it again and make it again. That's hard to do in a business, and it's hard to justify to the finance people. But it comes down to faith and trust in a process. And creating the conditions for creativity to flourish is partly about creating the conditions where that freedom to continually adjust and persevere and be tenacious exists. And that's what it's the responsibility of creative leaders to do. Does anyone recognize this? Hokusai, a Hokusai print of Mount Fuji. Hokusai was an artist and a printmaker who was working in Japan in the 18th century. And I just love this because he talks about how it's taken him 50, 60 years even to, in his view, make work that's worthy even of looking at. His respect for his creative process is such that, he recognizes that as a practitioner, he's always learning. And for those of us who work in creative jobs, that I think is so important to reconnect with. That as creative professionals, we're always learning and we're always kind of subject to the rigors of the discipline that we've chosen. So that's how I would kind of sum up the means to the end. So how do you get to a place where you are able to deliver something that answers a need that maybe hasn't even been recognized yet? So you can be the Bill Bauman, you can be the Lego of this world, you can be the Alexander McQueen of this world. And the first thing, of course, is to be prepared to take risks and to live dangerously. And the second, and I really think this is worth doubling down on because it's so hard to do in business, is to really open your ears and really create processes where everybody within that organization is able to contribute. The third, which is the fun part, actually doing through making. So creating the conditions where people of different disciplines can get together effectively and collaborate and contribute together. And the last thing is just keep at it and just keep persevering. And that's how great, standout, transformative creativity happens. Thank you very much for your close attention at lunchtime.